determination of quorum.
Evans. Here. Nordstrom.
Here.
Roberts.
Here.
Stroman. Here. Armstrong.
Here.
A quorum is present.
Thank you. And now it's time for the adoption of the agenda. Move to adopt. Have a motion to adopt by Councilman Nordstrom, a second by Councilman Stroman. Roll call vote.
Evans. Nordstrom.
Aye.
Roberts.
Aye.
Stroman. Armstrong.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Now it's time for general public comment. This is a time for members of the public to discuss or express concerns to the committee on any issue not limited to items on the agenda. Action will not be taken at the meeting on any issue not on the agenda except by placement on the agenda by unanimous vote of the council members present. I don't see anybody jumping up and down. I don't have anything on the dais, so I will close general public comment. We'll move on to consent items 1 through 8. I don't believe anybody wants to pull anything, so if I can get a motion. Have a motion to approve by Councilman Evans, a second by Councilman Stroman. Now for a roll call vote.
Evans. Nordstrom.
Aye.
Roberts.
Aye.
Stroman. Aye. Armstrong.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to non-consent items 9 and 10. We will open public comment. I have one speaker form from Janelle Fink. If you would get to the dais and give us your name and address or where you're from, and you can have the dais or the podium.
Good afternoon. My name's Janelle Fink. I'm with Fisk Land Surveying, and I am here on behalf of landowner Les Denke in regard to agenda item number 9, which is a variance request to waive the requirement to install sidewalks on Pecan Lane and East St. Patrick Street. I don't know if we had a little bit less light, we might be able to see that a little bit better. Mr. Denke is oh, that's better, thank you. Mr. Denke is a retired Vietnam veteran living on a fixed income, and he lives on the corner of Pecan Lane and East St. Patrick Street. He's been saving for several years to build a garage. As part of his application for building permit for garage, it triggers the requirement for him to install sidewalk on both Pecan Lane and East St. Patrick Street. We submitted our request to waive that sidewalk requirement, and I believe staff was in support of the variance on Pecan Lane due to the fact that there are several issues there. It's a narrower right-of-way. It's only a 40-foot wide right-of-way. It's a gravel street. It's not paved. There's no curb. There's no gutter. There's no sidewalk. There's no storm sewer. And there are some drainage issues within this area that the installation of a sidewalk probably would not necessarily coincide with a cohesive development project that might come forward in the future for this particular area. And staff was not in support of the variance to waive the sidewalk on East St. Patrick Street. So I'm here today to ask your consideration for that. There are kind of several reasons here that we're looking at this. Number one, I guess we'll start with the structure that we're looking at here was built in 1936. It actually predated the subdivision. So the house has been there for ages. This subdivision, Rapid Valley subdivision, was platted in 1952. It was outside the city limits, so it was not part of the city limits, and I don't think sidewalks were ever conceived of when they created these lots. So, and the house itself, not to be too revealing, but equalization assesses the house value at less than $35,000 in this particular instance. The requirement to install sidewalk on East St. Patrick Street at, I'm going to just ballpark an average of $7 to $10 per square foot. There's a lot of site prep involved here. There's a significant hedge on the north side that would need to be removed, so it's more than just an average sidewalk. But the cost for this sidewalk alone is probably $6,000 to $7,000, which is a huge percentage of the value of even the house. Additionally, and I believe I sent a few photos in an email to you. I'm kind of missing a little piece here. I'll kind of slide this back and forth a little bit. Okay, Mr. Denke's property is this area right here. There are 5 residences, single-family residences that abut East St. Patrick Street, and between Highway 44 and Ivy Avenue, which is roughly 2 miles, these are the only 5 single-family residences on that entire street. Everything else is either commercial, industrial, or multifamily. In those instances, those businesses would have the ability to generate income to offset the cost should a sidewalk be required in any areas that it isn't installed. And Mr. Denke, unfortunately, doesn't have the ability to offset those costs. I certainly appreciate the need for sidewalks. It's not that we're against sidewalks by any means. I think they're an important part of the community. But one of the things that I find that is kind of inequitable about our system, where the building permit triggers this, is it's regardless of the cost of the building permit, regardless of the individual's ability to pay for this. We did a site plan for Kiefer Sanitation just across the street, which is a multi-million-dollar company. And when they come forward with their building permit, they'll install sidewalks. There's a huge disparity or difference between a company that generates that kind of income and someone who's retired and living on a fixed income. I really think that it is inequitable in these circumstances to look at everybody the same way when it comes to sidewalk installation. I wish that there were measures in place whereby the city would help support or supplement or fund for those people that are on a fixed income where you have a situation like this. But for today, we don't have that mechanism available. So in light of these items that I've brought forward to you, I would ask that you support and waive the requirement to install sidewalk at this time on East St. Patrick Street for Mr. Denke. Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle. Now I'll open it up to questions from the dais.
Thank you for speaking, Ms. Fink. I totally agree with you. I just went out there an hour and a half ago and I walked it myself. Frankly, the sidewalks all the way from Campbell, clear up to a block from Mr. Denke's house, they're beautiful. And the reality is we need to finish that sidewalk, clear out to Highway 44, going to the airport with all that new development. There's nothing beyond a block from his property. And I don't see the purpose right now of installing that about 200 feet. There's about 200 feet of sidewalk in there, something like that. Along that at this point, it needs to be done because that's a heavily traveled area, but the whole thing needs to be done. And to kind of crush this guy's hopes and dreams or whatever with that significant expense, I don't see as the solution. I think we should come up with a different way of getting it all done, whether it's through some assessment of everybody throughout there or wait until the people developing that corner on 44 and East St. Pat do it. Maybe they can all be done at a much cheaper rate through the whole thing, but the whole thing needs to be done. And so I think at this point, I'd like to offer a substitute resolution that we give a waiver for both of those to revisit installing that sidewalk as a complete unit sometime in the near future, because it definitely needs to be put in all the way out to 44. So, thank you.
And I think I would need to clarify that motion and get a second on it. I think the motion you're trying to make is to waive the sidewalk in full, so on both of the streets. Okay, and if I could get a second on that, we can discuss it more, or we can let it die. No second? So that dies for lack of second. Go ahead, Mr. Nordstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll make a motion to uphold staff's recommendation to deny the variance on St. Patrick, but approve the variance on Pecan Lane.
I'll second that. Laura Armstrong.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
I appreciate your presentation, Janelle. I really respect your work and the information you provided for us. I'm going to try to do the best I can to help out Mr. Denke as well. I know, right now, I know we can't get CDBG money available for him. Otherwise, there might be a potential to be able to assist him on that. But give us an opportunity to look around for some other avenues to financially assist him. At this point, I know of only two ways to do that, and that's through what Mr. Evans talked about, is doing an assessment, or he can do a second option, and maybe some other folks have got some other ideas, but the other option is he can do it on the loan. When he, I assume he will do a loan or some kind of a financial setup to do his structure, constructing of the building that he's looking at. And I can definitely appreciate where he's at and understand his circumstance, but I'd like to get the opportunity, or maybe somebody else has got some better ideas about some financial assistance for Mr. Denke. That's my motion, Mr. Chair, and I believe I've said everything I need to. Thank you.
Do we have anybody else that wishes to speak? You're going to have to speak up because it's not coming up on my screen.
I'd like to
Go ahead.
comment again. So if we go ahead and approve this, the Pecan Street is waived. The other one, he has to go ahead, so we really don't help him out at all as far as I'm concerned. I don't think we should be in the process of causing people excessive stress, especially when it is of virtually no use. I mean, that one stretch of sidewalk isn't determining whether or not people are walking along there. And like I say, the entire thing needs to be done. And I'm looking down the dais at a couple people live in the neighborhood where there are no sidewalks, and I don't know what they'd be feeling if they were forced to put in a chunk of sidewalk on their street when all the adjacent neighbors don't have any. It just doesn't seem equitable to me. So, by the way, are you not allowed as the chair to second a motion?
You know, typically I don't. You know, I could have seconded it. It probably would have failed, I'm guessing.
I'm just trying to figure out where this goes now, because we approve this, he has to.
We have to pull it off a consent Monday night, and we'll discuss it then.
Okay, all right.
So, if there's nobody else that's going to get in the dais, if you don't mind, I'd like to put my 2 cents in real quick. And I do agree with Bill wholeheartedly here that we shouldn't be causing undue financial burdens to somebody. There is a third option. The third option is that he just doesn't build the garage, because if he can't afford it, he can't afford it. And I do want to say that there probably is no option if he's financing it to add the money into it, because what the bank is going to do is they're going to go out and they're going to appraise whatever that garage is worth, and they're not going to add an extra 50 to 100% into it to just give to you, especially right now with as tight as banks are getting. So I think that, you know, and I hope that doesn't happen, that he decides not just to build this if this is something he's been saving his money for years and years and years. You know, there's possibly some other options out there too. You know, I'd like to see the variance on this now, because typically with some of the other options out there, it takes a while to get them put into place. I know that, you know, through some people that I've worked with, that we do some projects for people like this, especially veterans that are on fixed incomes. You know, the last project we did was supposed to be about a $20,000 project that ended up being quite a bit higher than that because of all the infrastructure work we had to do and the sewer and water work that we had to do. But there are people out there, there are ways to get things like this done. Unfortunately, they just take time to do. And, you know, I would be happy to get a hold of Mr. Denke and talk to him about some possible things that can be done with this. I hope that at this point he just holds off for now, because I think that, you know, when you're talking about a home that's assessed for $35,000 and you're adding a $7,000 sidewalk to it, you know, you're talking, what, 20-some% of the actual value of the property. And the problem is, you know, you might say, well, he's adding value to his house. Well, with the sidewalk, he's not. So that $35,000 isn't going to go up. And, you know, there's no bank in the world that would give you a loan on a house for that price, and that's assessed for that amount of money to put something into it that's not going to add any value to your house. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Mr. Evans, you've got the dais again.
Alternate sources of funding. If we just had a way of making it less expensive would help. These keep coming up ever since I came on the council last summer, these legacy issues we have, and there's a zillion of them. You look at that map, it's loaded with them right there. And yet we still haven't come up with a policy that's going to allow us to make these things happen, because I totally believe in the consistency of the ordinances we have to install them. But that doesn't accommodate people without the ability to install them. And there's a reason why they live in places they live and whatnot. I don't think they're trying to avoid paying their fair share, but we're yet to come up with a way to make that possible for people that can least afford it. And I wish we would somehow come up with a policy to address these things that keep happening over and over and over and again in these public works meetings, to combine these, contract for like 6 of them so they can get it done at a cheaper rate. Let's face it, if you bring the concrete guy out to do this one stretch, it's a lot cheaper if he has to do a big stretch. And I wish we had something where we could make those things happen. And I don't know right now, with the experience I've got here, how to make such a thing happen, but maybe we can work toward that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Anyone else want to get in? If not,
Mr. Roberts,
yes.
may I speak, please?
Well, I suppose. Go ahead.
Just, well, I value your insight on this, especially with your profession. If we were to say that the sidewalk had to be put in, how long does Mr. Denke have to comply with that?
That is a question you'll have to ask Mr. Tech.
May I direct that question to Mr. Tech, please?
May.
Thank you. Mr. Tech?
Thank you, Alderwoman Armstrong.
Armstrong.
Yes,
Alderman.
I'm thinking of other things while I'm trying to address you. So, the building permit is typically good for 2 years, I believe. So, someone will step in if I'm saying something incorrect. I'm assuming. I'm looking at Ted over here.
That was exactly my thought.
Right, but when they pull the building permit and start work on the structure, the expectation is that for the building permit to be complete and a certificate of occupancy, which I don't know if is needed for a garage or not, it is, the sidewalk will have to be done for that to be accepted.
Okay, that was my question. I was hoping that would be some sort of compromise, and there was a 2-year window, he would have enough time to get that money to do that. I'll yield my time. I thank you for your answers.
Thank you, Councilwoman Armstrong. Anyone else? If not, we've got a motion on the floor. All in favor? Oh, roll call vote, yep.
Evans. Nordstrom.
Aye.
Roberts.
Nay.
Stroman. Aye. Armstrong.
Aye.
Motion carries 3-2.
Thank you very much. And just a point of preference, Bill, because there was 2 no's on it, it won't go on to consent, so it will be read in Monday night, so we'll be able to discuss it. So we will move on to item number 10, request, or wait a minute, that was just, oh, never mind. Item number 10, request from Davis Engineering Incorporated for a variance to waive the requirements to install sidewalk along Deadwood Avenue, Rapid City, per ordinance 12.08.060. And the staff recommendation is to deny. Who would like to speak on this? I knew you would, Bill. Go ahead.
Well, Richie and I went out and saw this thing, what, a month and a half ago. I'm looking at beautifully poured asphalt. It's a shame to ruin something that's great. I think it's wasteful. I think it's not ecological. I don't think it's it's not fiscally responsible. And so I said, why don't you guys come up instead with a way that we can reuse that. As far as I know, there's no requirement that a sidewalk needs to be made out of concrete. I think they've come up with a plan where they've segregated the parking from the pedestrian circulation and created what actually should be a very pleasant sort of sidewalk experience without having to destroy what's already poured in place, then just replace asphalt with concrete. And so I hope you give them the waiver, because I think it's a creative and frankly aesthetically pleasant solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Anyone else want in the queue? Laura?
Yes, sir. May I direct a question to Mr. Tech again?
You may.
Thank you, Mr. Tech. Could you briefly explain why the staff recommended to deny?
Certainly, there's a number of reasons. First of which, the parking area that exists there, keep in mind Deadwood Avenue is a DOT right-of-way. It's a DOT highway. The City of Rapid City's jurisdiction in that right-of-way is to permit sidewalks. The current parking area that they have on their property encroaches into the public right-of-way. I spoke with the DOT the other day. They did a site visit some time ago. Noticed that the parking area is an encroachment into the right-of-way and needs to be removed. Second of all, our standard specifications do require that sidewalk be concrete. And those are the two primary reasons. Once again, the ordinance that the city has on the books to require installation of sidewalks is not a perfect ordinance. However, if it is followed in every instance, eventually all properties in Rapid City will have sidewalks.
So for continuity reasons?
There are no continuity requirements in the ordinance. It just states that when a property, someone applies for a building permit on the property, that's the time that they are required to install sidewalks. Years ago, it was when the developers developed the property, they were required to install sidewalks ahead of all the building. That didn't work very well because most of the sidewalks ended up getting destroyed during the construction of the building. So the latest iteration of the ordinance, which I think has been in place since the early 2010s, has required that it's at the time of building permit.
Thank you, Mr. Tech. I yield.
Thank you, Councilwoman Armstrong. Go ahead, Mr. Evans.
Question for Mr. Tech again. I know the DOT has certain encroachment rules and everything, but isn't it true that there's many, many instances all over the place where they don't necessarily enforce that encroachment, problem, and they just sort of grandfather it in because it was already done? That's what I was told, anyhow.
When the DOT does any sort of contract work on their highways, one of the very first things that they do is an encroachment survey. And they send letters to anyone with an encroachment telling them that they have to have that encroachment removed. To my knowledge, they haven't touched Deadwood Avenue with any significant project in quite some time, but I would anticipate if they were to go in and repave or do something to that roadway, the adjoining landowners would be required to remove encroachments.
So my understanding is if they were to redevelop Deadwood Avenue, repave it, widen it or whatever, then all the businesses along there would be in the same boat and they'd all have to put in the sidewalk, and then we'd have a continuous sidewalk that made sense rather than these, again, haphazard little chunks, like a person with missing teeth. We're kind of creating room to do this. So if I see that would be the solution at that point then to solve the problem. And meanwhile, I think that what they've come up with as a temporary solution certainly satisfies our need to keep the people on a dedicated walking area and away from the traffic. And so if the DOT does decide to do that, then the problem's solved, because then everybody has to put in a sidewalk. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Evans. Councilman Stroman, you have the dais.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Councilman Evans that The solution that's stated in Semler Construction's letter dated March 30th, to provide a public walkway by using the existing surface, I think that meets the intent of the sidewalk requirement. I also agree with their proposal that they would agree to construct the concrete sidewalk at such time when both the property owners to the left and to the right side of Bargain Barn are required to construct their sidewalk. So for the time being, I'm satisfied with the attempt that Semler has made to meet the spirit of the requirement, and I think that it does meet the intent of the ordinance requiring the sidewalk. And for that reason, I would want to see this variance approved as stated in their letter.
Thank you. Councilman Nordstrom. After you. Go ahead, Mr. Tech.
Thank you. There's another reason that staff's recommendation was to deny is ADA requirements are very specific when it comes to sidewalks. There's a 2% cross slope maximum. We have no idea what that asphalt is. It could be 3%, it could be 4%. There are some, I believe that this board or the city council even needs to have additional information before you make a judgment on using alternate paving materials for sidewalk, because it may be non-compliant. I feel that the city may run a risk if your recommendation is to recommend approval of something that doesn't meet ADA requirements. And that's another purpose for the ordinance that we have in place, is to make sure not only that there is a walkway for pedestrians for multimodal access, but it's also ADA compliant.
Go ahead, Mr. Nordstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will make a motion to uphold staff's recommendation to deny, and if I get a second. Not hearing any. May I continue?
You may.
My concern with the suggestion, and I think Mr. Evans has got some very innovative ideas on this, but I'm thinking that if it goes along with this recommendation that we're pursuing, we'd have to change the ordinance. And with that in mind, I think we'd have to take a real hard look at it, because of the changes that would be involved would be citywide. And with the concerns that we have with ADA issues, as Mr. Tech mentioned, is that it would be very difficult to have just anything, and I'm not saying all of the, but just anything that comes forward to be based upon the circumstances as it is presented today. The other factor that I keep going back to is that in our previous discussion, we had a conversation a little bit about a company across the street that would be able to afford the sidewalk. I feel that we're approaching the same situation, that this company could afford to do the installation of the proper sidewalk. So that's where I'm at, is just to comply with what we have on the books right now, and the feasibility for the present company as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nordstrom. Mr. Tech, you have the floor again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'll throw something out. If this recommending body is so inclined to waive the requirements, just do that. Don't try to come up with some alternating paving alternative. Just waive the requirement, and then this can be solved at a later date. But by allowing the use of paving or straw and clay as an alternate paving for sidewalk, I think that's a slippery slope. So if this board is inclined to waive the requirements, just waive the requirement.
Thank you, Mr. Tech, and if I can have just a minute.
Well,
Go ahead. You can speak
responding to
before-
that, then we should tear out all the paving in Main Street Square, which is brick. It's not concrete. Am I correct? Well, but the surface is brick. So, I mean, we've got to start coming, rather than, just sort of these draconian rules we have that may fit a situation or not, we've got to address them individually. And in this case, it's a really nice solution, be it temporary or not, until the rest of the road is redone and everybody puts in a sidewalk. But we've got to start being creative. There's a lot of communities out there where concrete is not the standard for a sidewalk. In fact, they don't even let you put it in. I'm just talking to my sister in Akron. There's parts of that town you have to use brick pavers. I mean, so, waiving the requirement is not the solution, or changing the ordinance is not the solution. The solution is to look at each instance, go out and walk it, and see if it works. Because that's what the government's supposed to be doing, taking care of each individual citizen. And that's what I'm trying to do here. So that's where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And if I can just have 1 minute. I agree with pretty much everything you say, and I also agree with what Mr. Tech says. There's no reason we can't just waive the requirement to put a sidewalk in, but we cannot say we're going to approve as a body. We can't say we're going to approve what you're going to do with your sidewalk. That's when we get into liability issues. If we just wave it off, it's like us saying, you don't have to put in a sidewalk, you don't have to do anything, and we're not taking responsibility for what's there. So we don't have to change the ordinance, we don't have to, take that liability. But once this body starts saying, well, you can use that, and we're going to approve of you using that, of course, if it doesn't meet ADA requirements, we could have some liability there. So as long as we just, approve the variance, we're fine. In my opinion, am I correct, Joel? Do you mind if I ask you that question, Mr. Landine?
No, I think you're correct. I mean, I think if they want to provide a path there and do that on their own, or if you want to condition that but not approve it and say I think this is where we're getting kind of bogged down, is this technicality of, are we approving this as a method of constructing sidewalk? If that gives you a comfort level with their asphalt to approve it, fine. But yeah, I would stay away from, as Alderman Roberts is saying we're approving this as meeting the requirements or an alternative, specifically for liability and other purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Landine. So we still need a motion on the floor since the last motion failed.
I'll make a motion to approve the variance.
Thank you, and I'm guessing that Mr. Evans will second that? So we have a motion on the floor from Councilwoman Armstrong and a second from Councilman Evans. All in favor? Oh, wait a
Evans.
minute. Roll call vote.
Roll call.
I'm not going to remember, and this is the last one.
Evans? Nordstrom?
No.
Roberts?
Aye.
Stroman? Armstrong?
Aye.
Motion passes 4-1.
Thank you very much. If I can get a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Did you want to get in, Laura? Did you want to have one last word?
I
Oh,
was
okay.
just saying
Thank
motion
you.
to adjourn.
Okay. All right. So we have a motion to adjourn by Councilman Stroman, and I think a second by Councilman Evans. All in roll call vote.
Evans? Nordstrom?
Aye.
Roberts?
Aye.
Stroman? Armstrong?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much. Very good discussion today. Thank you, and have a great day.